Hi there, assalamu alaikum everyone. Today we'll discuss about heart. If we see heart is a conical hollow muscular organ situated in the middle mediastinum. It's enclosed within the pericardium, and the Greek name for the heart is cardia, and which have adjective cardiac. The Latin name for the heart is cor which is from the adjective coronary. So which we can see there, the coronary basically comes from cor, and cardiac basically comes from cardia, which is a Greek name of heart. So heart is placed obliquely behind the body of the sternum and adjoining parts of the costal cartilages. So if you see the heart is basically situated one third to the right and two third to the left. Two third is situated into the left side, and one third is basically situated onto the right side. So basically human heart has four chambers. These are right and left atria and right and left ventricles, and we will describe these chambers. Okay, so two atria basically two in number and lie above behind the ventricles. On the surface they are separated from the ventricles by atrioventricular group. Atrioventricular, that means atria and ventricle. Atrium and ventricle, which is separated by atrioventricular groove. Okay, the atria are separated from each other by interatrial groove. Two atria, that means interatrial. Two atria, that means interatrial groove. Which is that groove mean? This groove means interatrial groove. The ventricles are separated from each other by an interventricular groove. Interventricle, that means two ventricle, which is separated by anterior and posterior parts. So if we see the measurement of heart, it's basically conical or pyramidal in shape, and its length is 12 cm from base to apex, and it is basically 300 gram in adult male and 250 gram in adult female. So okay, if we see the external features, the heart is apex directed downwards, forwards and to the left. Base is directed backwards. Surfaces anterior sternocostal, inferior right pulmonary, left pulmonary. So which surfaces anterior or sternocostal, inferior right pulmonary, left pulmonary. The surfaces are demarcated by upper, inferior, right and left borders. So which border? Upper border, inferior border, right border, left border. We can say that superior, inferior, right, left borders of heart. Previous concept we see that heart has basically three surfaces: anterior, inferior and left, and our latest concept we see that is basically four surfaces: anterior sternocostal, inferior right pulmonary, left pulmonary surface. So if we see the groups of sulci, the heart shows following sulci: atrioventricular or coronary sulcus. The atria are separated from the ventricles by circular atrioventricular or coronary sulcus. That means atrioventricular or coronary sulcus. Atrioventricular, that means atria and ventricle is divided by a circular sulcus, that is called circular atrioventricular or coronary sulcus. That is basically coronary sulcus. It is divided into anterior and posterior parts. So anterior parts consist of right and left halves, is overlapped by anteriorly ascending aorta and the pulmonary trunk. Ascending aorta and pulmonary trunk. Anterior part is consist of ascending aorta and pulmonary trunk. So that is basically our pulmonary trunk, and that is our ascending aorta. Overlapped by ascending aorta and pulmonary trunk. That is basically our heart. Atrium's small elevation, that is left auricle. Here we see that atrioventricular groove. That is our atrioventricular groove. That is our left border. That is our right border. Anterior interventricular groove. That is our anterior interventricular groove, and that is our posterior interventricular groove. That is situated basically posterior. So it's defined as dot dot. So it's basically called a posterior interventricular groove. And we see that a largest portion here. Total this largest portion is called left ventricle, and the very elevated portion of left ventricle we call that apex of the heart. So that is basically situated inferiorly. That's why it's called inferior border. That is our right ventricle. That is our inferior vena cava, through which the blood of our lower limb and lower part of our body comes through it, and that is called atrioventricular groove. That is our atrioventricular groove. That is our right border. That is right border, and that is called right atrium. And we can see a small elevation there. That is called right auricle. That is our ascending aorta, and that is called our superior vena cava. So if we see that here, we can see that interatrial groove, that means two atria are separated by a groove that's called interatrial groove. It's hidden by aorta and pulmonary trunk. Okay, anterior interventricular groove, it's nearer and to the left margin, to the right it runs downwards and to the left. Okay, the lower end of the groove separates apex from the rest of the inferior border of the heart. Posterior interventricular groove is situated on the diaphragmatic or inferior surface of the heart. Okay, diaphragmatic, what does that mean? That means it's situated basically above the diaphragm, that's why it's called diaphragmatic surface, and it's basically cling to the diaphragm, that's why it's called the diaphragmatic surface or inferior surface of the heart. So crux of the heart, meeting of the point interatrial, atrioventricular and posterior interventricular grooves. So where three grooves are meeting, that is the point of crux of the heart, that's called crux of the heart. Is the basically meeting point of interatrial, atrioventricular and posterior interventricular groove. Apex of the heart is formed entirely by left ventricle. Okay, apex of the heart basically formed by the left ventricle, that is our apex, and it's totally formed by the left ventricle. And we see that it's directed downwards, forwards and to the left, and it's overlapped by anterior border of left lung. Okay, it's overlapped by the left lung. So here we see that left lung, and we see here right lung, so it's basically overlapped by left lung. Location is situated on the left fifth intercostal space, 9 cm lateral to the mid-sternal line, just middle to the mid-clavicular line. Basically it's situated left fifth intercostal space and 9 cm lateral to the mid-sternal line, just middle to the mid-clavicular line. So apex impulse is outer thrust of an apex of the heart during ventricular systole observed in fifth intercostal space, just medial to the mid-clavicular line, and apex beat is felt at the side of the apex impulse. So you see that is basically our coronary sinus. Heart basically circulates its own wall also, that is called coronary circulation. So we can see that here, that is our coronary sinus. If we see any abnormality in the left side, if the apex beat is not situated on the left side of the body, on the other hand it is situated on the right side of the mid-clavicular line, we can call that dextrocardia. So dextrocardia may be a part of condition called situs inversus, in which all thoracic and abdominal viscera are a mirror image of normal. So situs inversus, that means side inversion. If we see the base of the heart, it's basically composed of left atrium. And part of right atrium. If you see the features of the base, the base has openings of 4 pulmonary veins. That is our opening of 4 pulmonary veins. 2 veins for each lung for circulation of blood. So superior and inferior vena cava, which open into the right atrium. Okay, that is our superior and that is our inferior vena cava. If we see the level of the base, it's related to the T5 to T8 vertebra in the lying posture, and it descends by 1 vertebra in erect posture. So in erect posture, which we can get T6 to T9 vertebra. So if we see external features of the heart, we can see apex, base, surface, borders. Apex is conical formation, left ventricle. Base is basically posterior surface formation, 2/3 by left atrium and 1/3 by right atrium. Surface is anterior, inferior, left and right. Borders basically for right, left, inferior and upper borders. If we see the grooves of the heart, we see that coronary sulcus, interventricular sulcus, interatrial sulcus. Coronary sulcus that separates the atria from ventricle. Its contents are trunk and circumflex branch of left coronary artery, coronary sinus, right coronary artery, anterior cardiac vein. So if we see the interventricular sulcus, it basically composed of anterior and posterior, but anterior surface basically contains anterior interventricular branch of left coronary artery, great cardiac vein, and posteriorly we see that posterior interventricular branch of coronary artery and middle cardiac vein. So interatrial sulcus separates atria, indicates attachment of the interatrial septum. We see that later surface of the heart, it basically anterior sternocostal surface, inferior diaphragm surface, and left surface, right surface. So which is composed of right atrium, right auricle, left ventricle and right ventricle. Basically all structures are related to the anterior sternocostal surface, and features are atrioventricular groove and anterior interventricular groove. If we see the inferior diaphragmatic surface, we see here left ventricle and right ventricle, and its content are posterior interventricular groove. We see the groove here, posterior interventricular groove only. If we see left surface, left auricle and left atrium, it basically convex rounded left atrioventricular groove. Okay, and if we see the right surface, we see here right atrium and rounded sulcus terminalis. Sulcus terminalis, where rough part and a smooth part are connected together, that's called sulcus terminalis. So right surface we found rounded sulcus terminalis. The borders of the heart is basically composed of four border: right, left, inferior and upper border. So right border we see here right atrium, an extension from the opening of superior vena cava to inferior vena cava, and left border basically left ventricle and partly by left auricle, and its extension from left auricle to the apex of the heart. So in the inferior border we see here it's basically formed by mainly right ventricle, partly by left ventricle. So basically it's composed of right ventricle and partly by left ventricle, and from the opening of inferior vena cava to the apex of the heart is its extension. Upper border we see here right and left atria, from upper end right heart border to left heart border. So that is our diagram. That is the right border, that is our superior or upper border, that is left border, apex and inferior border. Anterior view and posteriorly we see there, that is our left border, that is our coronary sinus, that is our apex, that is inferior border, right border and superior border. So okay, so if we see abnormalities in the apex position of heart, that is called dextrocardia. So inferior border is nearly horizontal, formed mainly by the right ventricle. We have discussed it earlier. Surface of the heart, anterior sternocostal surface, inferior diaphragmatic surface. Sternocostal surface, that means it has attachment with the sternum and costa, that means ribs of our body. So it's formed mainly the right atrium and right ventricle, and partly by left ventricle and left auricle. So left atrium north in anterior surface, and it's covered by aorta, pulmonary trunk, and most of the sternocostal surface covered by the lungs, but part of that lies in behind the cardiac notch of the left lung is uncovered. The uncovered area is dull on precursion. So here we see that anterior sternocostal surface, it's formed mainly by the right atrium and right ventricle, partly by left ventricle and left auricle. The left auricle is not seen on the anterior surface. Okay, it's covered by aorta and pulmonary trunk. Most of the sternocostal surface is covered by the lungs. So sternocostal surface, it's basically covered by the lungs, but a part of it lies behind the cardiac notch. Behind the cardiac notch, we found cardiac notch there, but part of it lies behind the cardiac notch, and of the behind the cardiac notch of the left lung is uncovered. So here left lung is uncovered. The uncovered area is dull on precursion, so we call it superficial cardiac dullness. Superficial cardiac dullness. So inferior diaphragmatic surface, it rests on the central tenon of the diaphragm. It's formed in the left two-third of the left ventricle. So it forms the left two-third of the left ventricle, and right one-third to the right ventricle. It traversed by the posterior interventricular groove and directed downwards slightly backwards. Left surface, right surface. Okay, types of circulation. There are main two types of circulation: systemic and pulmonary. So right atrium, it's basically upper chamber of the heart. It receives venous blood from whole body. So that is our right atrium. Right atrium basically collects blood from superior vena cava and inferior vena cava. Superior vena cava collects the blood from superior region of our body. That means head, neck, and our upper limbs. That is go through the superior vena cava, and the blood of our lower limb, it goes through the inferior vena cava. So these two vena cava are meet into the right atrium. So okay, the chamber is elongated vertically, receiving the superior vena cava at the upper end of the inferior vena cava and the lower end. Okay, the upper end is prolongated and left to form the right auricle. The auricle covers the root of the ascending aorta, partly overlaps infundibulum of the right ventricle. Its margins are notched and interior sponge-like, which prevents free flow of blood. Okay, along the right border of the atrium there is a shallow vertical groove which passes from superior vena cava to inferior vena cava. That is our right atrium. If we see elevated area here, that is called musculi pectinati or pectinate muscle. It is formed by pectinate muscle, that's why it's called musculi pectinati, and the terminal region here, that's called crista terminalis. And its upper portion we see here right auricle, and upper of right auricle we see here pulmonary trunk, arch of aorta, superior vena cava, that is our right pulmonary artery, and two right pulmonary veins. And we see here a small oval structure that is called fossa ovalis, and its margin is called annulus ovalis. Okay, so if we see from behind, that is our That is our coronary sinus, and that is our coronary sinus, and that is our inferior vena cava. That is our bulb of inferior vena cava. That is bulb of coronary sinus. Septal cusp of tricuspid valve, and that's all. And if we see a second dimensional figure here, we see here superior vena cava to right auricle, openings of vena cordis minimi. That is our called vena cordis minimi, and oval structure, border is called annulus ovalis, and ectoral structure is called fossa ovalis. Opening of coronary sinus, bulb of coronary sinus, bulb of inferior vena cava, and that is our inferior vena cava, and that elevated areas are called musculi pectinati, and its the terminal portion called crista terminalis. That's all interior of right atrium cut along sulcus terminalis. So if we compare systemic circulation and pulmonary circulation, systemic circulation, we see here the blood flows goes through the left ventricle to aortic valve, aorta, oxygenated blood to all tissues except lungs. Venous blood collected superior and inferior vena, and they all go through the superior and inferior vena cava, and all blood accumulates into right atrium. On the other hand, if we see pulmonary circulation, at first it accumulates into right ventricle, and from right ventricle it goes through pulmonary valve, pulmonary trunk, and pulmonary arteries only to lungs. Then deoxygenated blood gets oxygenated. Then through four pulmonary veins, the blood goes through left atrium. So you see here external features of right atrium. Its external features are elongated conical right auricle, sulcus terminalis, atrioventricular group. That is all of external features of right atrium. And internal features we see here sinus venerum, pectinate part, and auricle, and interatrial septum. So internal features of right atrium, we see here sinus venerum, pectinate part, and interatrial septum. So sinus venerum is smooth posterior part develops from right horn of sinus venosus. Right horn of sinus venosus, it basically forms a sinus venerum, and pectinate part, rough anterior part. Interatrial septum basically separates two atria, develops from septum primum and secundum, shows fossa ovalis, limbus fossa ovalis, and triangle of Koch. Sinus venerum, it shows openings of superior vena cava, opening of inferior vena cava with eustachian tube, opening of coronary sinus with Tivitian valve, and foramina venerum minimum. So it basically develops from right horn of sinus venosus. Pectinate part, it's basically rough anterior part, develops from a primitive atrial chamber, shows crista terminalis and musculi pectinati. So right atrioventricular orifice, blood passes out of the right atrium through the right atrioventricular tricuspid orifice and goes to the right ventricle. The tricuspid orifice guarded by the tricuspidal, which maintains unidirectional flow of blood. Internal features, we see the interior of the right atrium can be broadly divided into three parts: sinus venerum, pectinate part, and interatrial septum. Smooth posterior part of the sinus venerum developmentally is derived from right horn of the sinus venosus. Most of the tubules except anterior cardiac veins opens into superior vena cava, opens into the upper end. We all know about it. So here we see that opening of inferior vena cava is guarded by rudimentary valve of inferior vena cava or eustachian valve. So here coronary sinus open to opening of the inferior vena cava and right atrioventricular orifice. Okay, the vena cordis minima are small veins present in the walls of all four chambers. The intervenous tubercle of floor is very small projection, scarcely visible on posterior wall of the atrium just below the opening of superior vena cava. During embryonic life, it directs the superior caval blood to right ventricle. Triangle of Koch is bounded by ostium of coronary sinus, septal leaflet of tricuspid and tendon of Todaro. Rough anterior part or pectinate part, including the auricle, developmentally is derived from the primitive atrial chamber. It presents series of transverse muscular ridges called musculi pectinati. They all rise from crista terminalis and run forwards and downwards toward the atrioventricular orifice, giving the appearance of teeth of a comb. In auricle, the muscles are integrated to form reticular network. If we see right ventricle, here basically externally right ventricle true surface, sternocostal and inferior diaphragmatic surface. Right ventricle separated externally from the right atrium by atrioventricular groove. Right ventricle is separated from left ventricle by anterior posterior interventricular grooves. Okay, internal features, we see that its interior part has basically composed of two parts, inflowing and outflowing part. Inflowing part is rough due to presence of muscular ridges called trabeculae carnea, and outflowing part or infundibulum is smooth and forms the upper conical part of right ventricle, which gives rise to the pulmonary trunk. It develops from the mid portion of the bulbis cordis. Okay, so that's our arch of aorta, pulmonary trunk, pulmonary valve, supraventricular crest, septal papillary muscle, that is a septal papillary muscle, and there's our posterior papillary muscle, that is our septomarginal trabecula. There's a septomarginal trabecula, and we see the projections here. It's called chordae tendineae. That is our anterior papillary muscle, and that is our septomarginal trabecula. That's our septomarginal trabecula, and that is our anterior papilla. So which papilla we get here? Anterior papillary muscle, that is our posterior pituitary muscle, and we see here chordae tendineae. There's a tricuspid valve, and we see left side of the bicuspid valve. Okay, that is our right atrium, right auricle, and that is our superior vena cava. That's all interior of right ventricle. So basically, external features we see here: triangular chamber forms the inferior border, most of the sternocostal surface and part of inferior surface of the heart, separated from right atrium by right atrioventricular groove, and from the left ventricle by anterior intraventricular groove. So its internal features are consist of three part: inflowing, outflowing, and intraventricular septum. So inflowing part we see here rough part. So rough part basically develops from primitive ventricle, shows trabeculae carni, ridges, bridges, pillars, papillary muscle, anterior posterior, and septal papillary muscle. Moderate band we can see here chordae tendineae, opening of tricuspid valve. Outflowing part we see here smooth, developed from conus cordis of valvus cordis. Conus cordis, middle 1/3 of valvus cordis, shows pulmonary orifice, supraventricular crest. So in interventricular septum we see here anterior muscular part develops from muscular ridge arising on the floor of the primitive ventricle, and posterior membranous part develops from proliferation of atrioventricular portion. So here we see ridges, bridges, and papillary muscles. So we see here trabeculae carni or muscular ridges of three types in the anterior of right ventricle. So here we can see intraventricular septum is placed obliquely, membranous part and muscular part its composition. So if we see a transverse section of our heart, we see that sternocostal or anterior surface 2/3 and 1/3, medial 2/3 and lateral 1/3. So here we see pulmonary orifice, that is our aortic orifice, and pulmonary orifice. We see here tricuspid orifice, that is our mitral orifice or bicuspid orifice. There's our posterior papillary muscle, that is our anterior papillary muscle, interventricular septum we see here, and that is our posterior intraventricular groove. There's our posterior intraventricular groove, and that is our anterior intraventricular groove. And we see here that is our anterior papillary muscle. Left atrium is a quadrangular chamber situated posteriorly. Quadrangular chamber, that means its angle is 4, or it's basically quadrangular chamber situated posteriorly. It receives oxygenated blood from the lungs through 4 pulmonary veins and pumps it to the left ventricle through left atrioventricular or bicuspid or mitral orifice. Okay, so like Bishop's mitre, which is guarded by the valve of the same name. External features: its appendage, the left auricle projects anteriorly to overlap the infundibulum of right ventricle. Left atrium from left 2/3 of the base of the heart, the greater part of upper border, parts of sternocostal and left surface, and the left border. The posterior surface of the atrium forms anterior wall of the oblique sinus of pericardium. So we see there are two types of sinus. One there is a transverse sinus, and another is oblique sinus. So the posterior surface of atrium forms the anterior wall of oblique sinus of pericardium, and left atrium forms left 2/3 of base of the heart, the greater part of the upper border, parts of sternocostal and left surfaces of the left border. Its appendage, left auricle, projects anteriorly overlap the infundibulum of the right ventricle. The anterior wall of atrium is formed by the interatrial septum. Interatrial septum, the septal wall shows fossa lunata corresponding to fossa ovalis to right atrium. So that is our arch of aorta, pulmonary trunk, that is our left auricle. So here we see aortic valve, and that's our anterior papillary muscle. There's a inferior papillary muscle, chordae tendineae, and that is called pulmonary veins, fossa lunata or fossa ovalis. That is our valve of foramen. That is our left atrioventricular cusp. That's our left atrioventricular cusp or left atrioventricular valve. That is our inferior vena cava. So next page we see here that left ventricle it's basically receives oxygenated blood from the left atrium, pumps into the aorta. External features: it forms apex of the heart, a part of sternocostal surface, most of the left border of the left surface, and left 2/3 of diaphragmatic surface. Okay, so if we see comparison of right ventricle, left ventricle, thinner right ventricle, basically thinner, left 1/3 thickness of left ventricle. It's basically 1/3 thickness of left ventricle, pushes blood only through the lungs. So why it needs to be thick? Because it gives circulation to all over our body, so it needs to be muscular. That's why it can pump the blood through our body and our body remains normal.